Good morning if you are in the West Coast of the United States, and good afternoon if you are in the East Coast. Good evening if you're joining us from across the ocean, like our speaker does today. And so my name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I convene the online meetings of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. I done this for about 3 years and I basically retired, but I have just a couple of more meetings that I had organized, and one of them is this. So I'm very happy to host you all for today. And let me start by introducing our moderator, my very close and dear colleague, David Gutman. He is an associate professor of history at Manhattanville College. His research interests include the history of Ottoman Armenians at the end of empire, migration and mobility, mass violence against non-dominant communities, and the historiography of genocide. He's the author of The Politics of Armenian Migration to North America, 1885-1915, Sojourners, Smugglers, and Dubious Citizens, published with Edinburgh University Press in 2019, as well as several journal articles, book chapters, and review essays. He's also the co-editor and managing editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, and he is also the treasurer of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. He is the hardest working member of the board of the association, I can tell you that. So I'm very happy that he found a little time for us to moderate this session. David, take it away.
Thank you for that flattering introduction, Baki. I'm very happy to be here. Very much looking forward to this discussion. I want to thank İlkay Yılmaz and Janet Klein. İlkay for presenting on her new book, and Janet for providing the commentary. I've been looking forward to this event for quite a while, looking forward to having the opportunity to read İlkay's new book, which promises to be an important contribution to what is emerging as, I think, an important and really established historiographical literature in our field on migration, mobility, and mobility control, as well as on the questions of security, passports, documents. So without further ado, let me introduce İlkay and Janet. After the introductions, İlkay will speak for about 20 minutes on the book, give a kind of overview of her work. Janet will provide about a 10 to 15-minute commentary, and then we will open for question and answer. So İlkay Yılmaz is currently a Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft-funded research associate at Friedrich-Meinecke Institute, the Department of Modern History at Freie Universität in Berlin. She was an Einstein senior researcher in the same department. She was a research fellow at Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient between 2017 and 2019 on a Humboldt scholarship. She worked as an assistant professor at Istanbul University from 2014 to 2017. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Historical Sociology, Middle Eastern Studies, our own journal, JATSA, Photo Researcher Journal of the European Society for History of Photography. Her research interests include the history of security, passport history, inter-imperial collaboration on policing, state formation, and the history of violence in the late Ottoman Empire. And she is currently working on a long-term study of the securitization of the eastern provinces from the late Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey. The book that she's going to be speaking on today, Ottoman Passports, was published by Syracuse University Press in 2023, so fresh off the press. And it is a translation and an expansion of a book that she published in Turkey in 2014 by Tari Vakfıyurt called Serseri Anarşist ve Fesadın Peşinde İkinci Abdülhamid döneminde güvenlik politikaları ekseninde pasaport, mühür tezkeresi ve otel kayıtları. So Ottoman Passports condenses the name a little bit. And Janet Klein received her undergraduate degree from the University of Montana, her MA and PhD from Princeton University. Her book, The Margins of Empire, Kurdish Militias in the Ottoman Tribal Zone, was published by the other SUP, Stanford University Press, in 2011 and translated into Turkish in 2013. Dr. Klein has also authored numerous articles and book chapters on various topics related to late Ottoman and post-Ottoman Kurdish Armenian histories, and is currently working on a study of the construction of minorities in the late Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman states. She teaches on the modern Middle East and Ottoman Empire, as well as on such topics as nationalism and identity politics, mass violence, and borderlands and partitions. She is founding member and associate editor of the Kurdish Studies Journal. And so without further ado, İlkay, you now have the stage. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Yeah. No, okay. Okay, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank you to Baki, Tezcan, David Gutman, and Janet Klein for organizing, moderating, and also for the discussion as well. It's really a pleasure to be part of this, great OTSA, Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, in this way. So yeah, okay. I mean, my book. So I mean, I try to write about those themes like controlling the geographical mobility, anti-anarchism, infrastructural power and structural violence, administrative network, criminalization of Armenians, Bulgarian seasonal workers, and political activists during the Hamidian era. So, yeah, nearly 115 years ago, a 30-year-old Armenian woman named Margaret and her daughter, 12-year-old daughter, Aznif, from the town of Çardak, Karahisari, Sharki in Sivas, were given permission to leave for North America on the condition of no return to the Ottoman Empire. Their internal passports were, which were required for travel within the empire and could also be used as identity documents in practice, were confiscated, and their international passports were inscribed with the sentence, no return to the, no return to the Ottoman Empire henceforth. So it was written to their passports. They were registered for immigration to America, which also meant the deprivation of their citizenship according to a decree aimed at Armenians. And their photographs were filed at the local police station and circulated to the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The main reason for those bureaucratic regulations was that the Ottoman Empire suspected every Armenian who migrated to North America as a potential revolutionary, a conspirator, Fesat, against the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, that the Ottoman government deprived Armenians who migrated to North America after 1896 of their citizenship rights. I mean, basically after the Armenian massacres, right? Armenians with US passports were not allowed to re-enter the Ottoman Empire. And these two, I mean, Margaret and Aznef, were also the target of those regulations. Unlikely though it seems, actually, Margaret and Aznef's file was closely related to an event that shook another empire, the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary on September 10, 1898. So the assassination of Elizabeth, or, the famous Sisi, was part of the wave of assassination attempts against the members of the dynasty, high-ranking bureaucrats and bourgeoisie starting from Russia, Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Spain, France, Belgium, Iran, and even, the US. So it became a phenomenon during that era. The anarchist thinkers proposed the concept of propaganda by deed or direct action and the use of terror techniques as propaganda. So propaganda by deed was predicted on the idea that masses may only be stirred up and awareness can be raised through practicing propaganda by deed, as the impact of mass meetings, daily newspapers, declarations were limited in as much as manipulated by bourgeoisie. The ignored and looked upon demands and motions of the lower classes and the political oppression constitute legitimate base for these acts of violence. In the wake of this assassination by the Italian anarchist Luigi Luciani, the Italian government hosted the International Conference of Rome for the Social Defense Against Anarchists in 1898. So this conference was one of the first inter-imperial collaborations, or maybe you can say trans-imperial collaborations, that led to the founding of today's Interpol. The conference discussed how to define anarchists and anarchist acts, as well as contemporary methods of policing, surveillance, and extradition. Passport technologies and practices were important for knowledge exchange on controlling geographical mobility, and for inter-imperial information sharing as part of gathering intelligence on quote-unquote suspects. The bureaucratic infrastructure of passport practices was later standardized internationally. This historical turn also affected Ottoman passport practices. The Ottoman Empire was one of the first states to actively use the new technologies of filing, registering, and circulating intelligence, which also involved the use of photographs even before the conference, actually. So the book considers the history of two political issues, namely the Armenian question and the Macedonian question, and investigates how the Hamidian government tried to improve the capacity of the state to create knowledge of the Ottoman population and to implement political decisions throughout the realm of with its administrative infrastructure. So I analyzed two problems together, allowing me to draw on both the history of mobility restrictions and state control. These included regulations on passports and internal travel permit systems within the context of a fast expanding Ottoman police state. So this book provides a global institutional history of mobility restrictions and state documentation, analyzing travel regulations and other security practices within the context of a tumultuous late Ottoman political climate. It explores the Ottoman government's mobility restrictions as part of the government's attempt to collaborate within the joint European security efforts to form an inter-imperial criminal justice network system against anarchism. So this conference, the Rome conference, and in a later conference in St. Petersburg in 1904, significant issues that were raised include keeping records, setting up institutions for the surveillance of suspected individuals, as well as the use of passports and travel permits. So Ottoman Empire was one of the participant governments in these conferences, which were the first international attempts to create an international police cooperation. The new constellation of Ottoman passport practices were part of the everyday politics of security and can only be, according to me, can only be examined by placing them in the context of Armenian and Macedonian questions, both of which took place in frontier regions of the empire, and of course anti-anarchism during the late Ottoman Empire. So this book explores how mobility restrictions became critical to targeting groups including Armenians, Bulgarians, seasonal and foreign workers, and revolutionaries. The aim of the book is threefold. First, it investigates the international and internal security aspects of the Armenian and Macedonian questions in the late Ottoman period. It analyzes how these two important political topics became issues of security for the Ottoman government. In doing so, this book discusses the different political demands, not only from the political elites in Bulgarian and Armenian communities, but also from revolutionary circles as internal dimensions of the Ottoman domestic political context. It further examines how international political conflicts affected the Ottoman government's approach to these issues. Macedonia and Eastern Anatolia were marked by interstate competition, massacres, paramilitary violence, as well as extra-legal, state violence. Instead of analyzing these two regions with regional exceptionalism, I tried to examine these frontier regions as part of the debates on state formation and address the mobility controls in these regions in the discussions of control over territory and people. Second, the book explores the violent tactics of revolutionaries and also, the anarchists, as well as the international police cooperation that rose against such violence. So these acts became potent propaganda tools, and the Ottoman government responded with force, drawing on old and new security concepts to legitimize its newly oppressive tactics. The government also joined in international security collaborations against anarchism, as it sought to crack down on the overlapping categories of working class foreigners, Armenians and Bulgarians. Third, the book takes up the official discourse surrounding mobility restrictions. So Fesat, the conspirator or mischief, Serseri vagrant, and also anarchist, as well as how they played out in practice, comparing both to those being enacted in rival empires across Europe. In this way, the book situates the Ottomans within the global debates on migration, control over geographical mobility, police collaboration that rose in the 19th century. Taking up these new policies on surveillance, mobility, and control offers a timely look at the origins of contemporary immigration debates and the historical developments of terrorism, counterterrorism, and discrimination. Amidst the radical movements that opposed the period of Abdülhamit II, questions of mobility haunted Ottoman elites who searched for new security tools to exert state control. Here, the book deploys mobility to refer not only to immigration or emigration, but all kinds of movements, whether voluntary travel or forced displacement. The government grew more and more suspicious of particular classes of Bulgarians and Armenians, particularly those who were seasonal and trans-imperial workers. These and other imperial subjects were deemed threats as potential revolutionaries and members of secret societies. In this vein, the government developed suspicions about the Armenian poor and the Bulgarians, quote unquote, who might join the revolutionary circles. This book investigates the Ottoman methods of control during this period and asks three main questions. So, what was the political context that shaped the Ottoman security policies on geographical mobility? Which discursive traditions did authorities draw on to define sub-suspects, and how did they craft discourses to cast these groups as serious threats? Moreover, which mobility restrictions were enacted, and how did these measures play out in practice? To answer these questions, the book investigates not a specific region, but a certain set of practices. So this work further draws on critical security studies, critical theories of power, and historical sociology, and includes theories of modern state formation. So it has two arguments. First, the regime's attempts at controlling mobility were directly connected to the legitimacy crisis of the central government, rising radical opposition, the increasing of violence, and the loss of territories during the age of high imperialism. Second, mobility restrictions provide a useful indicator of the regime's power and a means for tracing long-term changes in the Ottoman administrative practices. So during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire came under the influence of its imperial rivals, the European great powers, and the Ottoman government started to conceptualize its own internal problems with reference to European and Russian colonial expansion, especially after the Treaty of Berlin. As a result, it targeted quote-unquote internal threats to the regime with new security policies that created new categories of suspects. This process also produced a new regime of internal passports aimed at controlling the state's newly defined internal enemies. So sovereignty, modern power, security created new versions of marginalities and criminalization of certain groups, and helped the state define new classes of subjects. These marginalities were usually attached to an ethnic and/or class identity, which can be traced in Ottoman passport practices. Challenges to that sovereignty gave rise to new attempts to restrict mobility. By building on these concepts, this book claims that the intersections of sovereignty, modern power, and security can be discussed via passport policies during the Hamidian era. So the passport regulations, internal passport regulation, they provide us with important insights into the ways the state positions itself in relation to within the Ottoman society and how the state pursues the foreigners who enter the Ottoman Empire as well. Passport controls were mainly registered in police documents when they exercised on persons who were identified as threat elements. So most of the archival documents deal with internal passport controls, especially mainly on the seasonal workers' arrivals and departures from Istanbul. Nonetheless, in the Hamidian era, precisely the Armenian seasonal workers were regarded as the potential vagrants, conspirators, seditious, and anarchists because of the political mobilization of revolutionaries. In the Hamidian era, the fear of political mobilization of lower classes by the means of nationalisms is attached with the fear of violent acts like bomb attacks and assassination attempts. The conjuncture was evident in relevance to the internal passport checks to control the traffic of Istanbul, which was practiced as a preventive mechanism against the political actions. So using those documents allowed me to connect those two histories and open the discussion that argues the relation between security definitions, mechanisms that paved the way to control geographical mobility and their effects on how the Ottoman government defined its internal enemies, which created structural violence towards the ones who were labeled as suspect elements or conspirators. By drawing on the correspondence between the ranks of imperial and local bureaucracy, this book provides an account of the legal and administrative structures, regulations, and practices. Likewise, the Ottoman bureaucracy created a narrative that connected these Ottoman security policies to the contemporary international police collaboration via anti-anarchism. In addition to internal political decisions, this book also offers an elaborated look into understanding how Ottoman security perceptions and travel regulations were directly linked to transnational security regimes, which can be analyzed through cross-border security policies, practices, discourses, and legal norms. The dynamic relation between security, sovereignty, paves the way to discuss the security institutions, norms, techniques, and practices with a reference to state formation. A critical reading of this dynamic relation also highlights the normalization of security practices and the normalization in the suppression of quote-unquote internal threats. This book argues that to intensify the surveillance as part of criminal policing, the Ottoman government also started to employ modern scientific methods of identification and further conducted investigations of suspect foreigners and Ottoman groups. However, instead of only using brand new techniques, the Ottoman Empire used these new surveillance technologies with old administrative and social control mechanisms, which had evolved throughout the centuries. The old and new surveillance mechanisms and their practice produced, distributed, and exchanged the knowledge of security threats through name lists, cards, files, periodical reports, among others, not only inside Ottoman bureaucracy, but also internationally. So my research on Ottoman passport practices reveals a state network of administrative offices, correspondences between these offices, both high-level bureaucrats, including ministries, and lower-level public officials, registers and personal identity documents, international passports, internal passports, photographs in administrative files, and identity documents. So not only the political decisions in high politics or law, but also everyday administrative decisions and regulations in daily life and basic paperwork created an administrative network that hung like a black cloud over the heads of the labeled. This administrative network consisted not only of administrative structure as offices, but of bureaucrats, bureaucratic correspondence, offices, documents, photographs, traditional social control mechanisms, and their actors, of course. These labels were also created on the ground of securitization of political issues and used through the administrative network. Decisions taken in relation to security both rendered politics a technical matter and increased state intervention in daily life. The administrative network emerged as a pattern, a mentality whose form can be traced in laws, regulations, and different kinds of decisions. This network also reveals how implementation extended from the very top of the bureaucracy to its lowest levels, and how spatial and temporal differences, contradictions functioned within this network. So the monitoring and controlling practices established by introducing regulations on passports, internal passports, indicate how the Ottoman government, the Ottoman Empire, broadened its scope of governance. The book provides an analysis of Ottoman passports in the global institutional history of state documentation. This approach makes it possible to place Ottoman passports within the global history, and also opens a window to argue that considering the passport policies as an example of state administrative practices at the level of politics of security can eliminate the politics towards defined suspect groups. In this case, in the Ottoman case, the Armenians, Bulgarians, and seasonal workers. So the legal framework also opens a legal space for exceptions that were mostly regulated not by laws, but by regulations and instructions in the Hamidian era. It is also evident that there is a similar perspective towards vagrancy, anarchism, and seasonal workers in different countries as well. Therefore, in the Ottoman context, there was a connection and overlap between the concepts, as I said before, the vagrant, anarchist, and fasad, which was also an Islamic concept. So this book explores the ways in which the threat perceptions shaped the security discourse of the political center. There is no doubt that the state elites of this period saw the survival of the state as being under threat. This threat perception of danger, the perception of danger also affected the language used in state correspondence. Anyways, answering all those questions that I mentioned before, as who used this discourse or how it was used and in which positions, helps in understanding the actors who took part in the discourse constructed along the axis of danger or threat, and in comprehending the mentality with which it was constituted. Thus, when attempting to understand the roles of those who use the discourse of danger and how they position themselves, we must also seek to understand the place of groups constructed as the objects of discourse within the state perception of threat and its security mentality. So this book also discusses the discourse of the center and the ways in which the state read the relations between fundamental actors, and how all this process creates marginalities and criminalization of some certain groups. Thank you.
Thank you, İlkay. So we will now proceed with the 10 to 15 or so minutes of comment by Professor Janet Klein, and then we will continue from there to the Q&A. Thank you, Janet. You have the floor.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Baki, for organizing yet another wonderful OTSA book talk. And thank you, İlkay, for producing this fascinating and really well-researched work that contributes so much evidence for some of the more recent claims that scholars have made that overturn assumptions about key developments in the Hamidian era of late Ottoman history. Since İlkay has presented many of the main arguments of her book, I'd like to zoom in on some of the implications of some of these arguments today in a little bit. So while the Hamidian era has long been known in the historiography of the late Ottoman Empire as a period marked by various crises of sovereignty and territorial integrity that plagued Ottoman statesmen, scholars have turned from focusing on the hallmarks of Hamidian rule, such as widespread censorship and pan-Islamism, to elucidating the ways in which Hamidian rule also needs to be characterized by its modernity, and how the Sultan himself engaged with global modernity in a variety of ways. Bit by bit, scholars of the late Ottoman Empire are moving away from making broad theoretical claims to providing evidence on a more granular level to kind of fill the nooks and crannies left untouched by these broader theoretical studies. And İlkay's book is one of these wonderful new works. So the main title of İlkay's book, Ottoman Passports, makes us think about the passports we are most familiar with today, those that allow us to cross international borders and return home to our countries of citizenship. But in İlkay's book, we don't actually get to these types of travel documents in the Ottoman context until the latter part of the book. And this is because she walks us carefully through the historical background that we need to understand about security and geographic mobility, the subtitle of her book, so that we can contextualize the ways in which geographic mobility and security were so deeply intertwined and brought the Ottomans into the global conversation about regulating travel and making citizens and other residents or travelers more legible, with the ultimate goal of not only protecting public order, but of protecting, of course, and this had long been a mission of Ottoman governance, but also, and perhaps especially, of protecting the state itself. In other words, security in the context of new existential threats in the 19th century were in the focus here. So indeed, as she illustrates in the book, the Ottomans were often at the forefront of developing and employing new technologies of filing, registering, and circulating intelligence, which also involved the use of photographs, even before the 1898 conference that led to the foundation of Interpol, as she writes. In her theoretical section, in which İlkay draws on the works of Tilly, Giddens, Scott, Foucault, and others, she points to two basic problematics of security faced by the modern or modernizing state: geopolitics and biopolitics. And this also brings her to discuss raison d'etat, which is inextricably linked to the problematic of security. Statespeople had to know how they could protect the state's well-being, not just that of the society it ruled over. The continuity of the state without diminished borders or sovereignty was the primary focus. But she asks, what happens when the security and continuity of the state are perceived to be at stake? From the perspective of raison d'etat, threats related to foreign policy, internal disarray, uprisings, and internal threats pave the way for the state to legitimize any actions on the grounds of security. In this way, she continues, the state is able to regulate the social order from within, however it sees fit. So in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere in the world, state leaders were guarded against the socialist, anarchist, and nationalist movements and their activists, as İlkay detailed in her presentation just now. And this also led to the suspicion of working classes in general. But in the Ottoman context specifically, state elites were especially wary of irredentist Balkan nationalism and the Armenian revolutionary movement. And so in consideration of the limited time we have here today, I'm only going to focus on the Armenian case. And here it's important to note that while we can certainly see restrictions on the mobility of subjects in earlier periods of Ottoman history, and that some of the older methods of suretyship, which were often required for travel, how these persisted and existed alongside modern surveillance and tracking. It was really after the Berlin Congress that followed the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877 to 78 that the state was impelled to conduct more detailed population data and, related to that, constructing new categories of internal enemy. For Armenians in particular, the groups to be feared, anarchists, socialists, the poor, and Armenian revolutionaries, became tightly woven together as a serious security threat, even an existential threat to the empire. And here is where the older concept of fasad, or sedition, was morphed to fit the turn of the century moment. So elsewhere, I've explored how Ottoman Armenians became minoritized in the context of the security threats state elites perceived that they posed to the empire's existence. And here, İlkay's work adds important pieces to that conversation as she builds on studies of Armenian mobility by scholars such as our own David Gutman, our moderator today. She discusses how in the 1890s, after the reforms planned for the so-called Armenian provinces began to be implemented following the massacres of 1894 to 96, Armenians, not just members of the Armenian revolutionary movement, but all Armenians, began to be referred to as mufsid, or seditious. In fact, a tiny little f for Fesad was added to travel documents of many Armenians, and several administrative documents and even articles in the press, as İlkay writes, use the word Ermeni, Armenian, directly in the place of Fesad or Fesadje, thus stigmatizing every person or group in the discursive field as Armenian and every Armenian as Fesad. Thus, she continues, the state approached the process solely as a security problem and tied to this perceived things through a good-evil opposition. So what the Armenians experienced here was the process of minoritization with dire consequences. Pandey, in his book Routine Violence, notes that nationalists ask, whose country is this anyway? Who was in the process of becoming the real citizens and who the marked citizens? As İlkay notes, the term Fesad was never used for Muslims, excuse me, even for those involved in the Baba Ali demonstration or other uprisings and violence. The targeting of Armenians in travel documents contributed to the notions of good and bad community that Pandey, for one, sees as part and parcel of the process of how minorities are constructed and how violence against them becomes routine. Muslims never needed to demonstrate their loyalty, but Christians, and particularly Armenians, did. As Pandey puts it, the test of loyalty is in fact required for those who are not real natural citizens, in other words, marked citizens. These marked citizens, who became marked precisely through the growing bureaucratization of these travel documents, were judged by their ability to conform to the current state of the national project, or to put it more bluntly, writes Pandey, by whether they were seen as threatening to the national community or not. In addition to this, aside from the Armenian Patriarchate, the state refused to see Armenians or their organizations as official political actors, as İlkay points out. By rendering Armenian revolutionary movements apolitical, the state rejected the legitimacy of any of their demands. In other words, state elites refused to consider why Armenian revolutionary movements had taken shape and why they might be appealing to Armenians not yet involved in these movements. In other words, just as we see protest movements by oppressed groups today repudiated by states as criminal or terrorist instead of political, with an eye to securitizing the entire group, Kurds, for example, today, so were Armenian organizations and Armenians at large criminalized and viewed solely as security threats. Climbing onto the international anti-anarchist bandwagon in this way, Ottoman officials also aimed to delegitimize Armenian appeals to great powers by criminalizing them and by suggesting that the Armenians were not a group with political demands for protection and ultimately equal citizenship, but the same enemy, anarchists, that European state elites saw as their own enemies. That was their hope anyway. It may be ironic that while the Ottoman state elites aimed to render Armenian activist movements apolitical or criminal, they did in fact politicize Armenian identity and even the previously apolitical designation Armenia on the map during this time. It's also interesting to explore restrictions on Armenian mobility within and beyond the empire's borders from the lens of minoritization. And İlkay's book offers us a fascinating lens through which to view this process. In her 6th and 7th chapters, İlkay presents an incredibly detailed account of what went into procuring, issuing, monitoring, denying, revoking, and even bypassing internal passports, as well as, excuse me, passports to cross the empire's borders. And here it appears from İlkay's discussion that it was really non-Muslims, especially certain groups in the Balkans and most Armenians who were the targets and ultimate victims of the increasingly vast administrative structure that went into policing or prohibiting their travel. As she notes, the ambiguity of such terms as şüpheli, suspect, serseri, vagrant, and fesad, seditious, applied particularly to Armenians, meaning that the decisions attempting to control them affected a broad swath of the Armenian community. Here she's discussing internal passports, but this applied to international passports as well. In fact, she writes that a significant proportion of the documents related to passport controls in the Ottoman archives have to do with the comings and goings of Armenians. In other words, as İlkay mentions later, passport practices made manifest the institutionalization of certain practices of discrimination towards specific groups. The security crises Ottoman state elites imagined to be posed by Armenians, as told through the lens of the bureaucratization of travel documents by İlkay, illustrates how the expansion of the police state that linked a security mentality, politics, and biopower adds a new layer to the discussion on labeling practices as symbolic violence toward marginalized groups, which was developed in synchronization with physical violence, as she points out toward the end of the book. So genocide doesn't just happen without a significant period of preparing the public to view a certain group as an existential threat to the nation. An increasingly sophisticated literature on the Armenian genocide has flourished over the past decade or two and has added much nuance and important new frames through which to understand how the confluence of dynamics internal and external to the empire came together to cast Armenians as perhaps the most dangerous group to the territorial integrity of the empire, and indeed to its very existence. İlkay's book adds another really important dimension to this picture. Through her book, we follow the nitty-gritty details of how the fear of Armenian separatism or other threats to the empire, in fact, contributed to one of the key institutions in the creation of the modern state: the ability to know and classify citizens and to control their movements. The securitization of not just Kurdish activists, but all Kurds in Turkey today is a contemporary phenomenon that we are familiar with, but one that dates back to the period İlkay explores in her book. İlkay, interestingly and perhaps devastatingly, has firsthand experience of the contemporary implications of the securitization and criminalization of certain groups that she traces through her work on Ottoman security and geographic mobility. As she was working on this book, she faced the consequences of signing the We Will Not Be Party to This Crime peace petition in 2016 in solidarity with those protesting the violent securitization of the Kurdish issue and Kurdish citizens of Turkey. She was one who was blacklisted and whose passport was tagged as suspect, the contemporary version of the F for Fesad marked on so many Armenian passports over 100 years ago. It's a great book. Congratulations, İlkay. And can I start the Q&A off with a question?
Absolutely.
I don't
Janet,
know
go
why
ahead.
my video, I'm sorry, I don't know why my video disappeared. Sorry about that.
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So passports are clearly related to citizenship and casting certain groups as enemies of the nation or marking them, if we were to think of Pandy's terms. They're also connected to citizenship. And so I'd like to hear a little more about how, if you were to write a chapter that explores the development of citizenship in the Ottoman context, you might bring together the various parts of the theoretical literature and the documentary evidence you explore to bring citizenship into the picture of security and geographic mobility that you explore. How were Ottoman conceptions and practices of citizenship connected to the development of travel documents or travel restrictions. How is the institution of citizenship shaped by concepts of real and marked desirable and undesirable citizens? Just a little question. Start us off.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful comments, and yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, interesting. So I guess the first question could be like how the Ottoman elites were identifying their own subjects, referring to what, right? And in this, I mean, for the Hamidian era, when you look at the materialities of the citizenship, I mean, the papers, you know, the identity papers, or, you know, nüfus tezkeresi, or the passports, internal passports, the first one is the first reference is to the community, the religion. So, I mean, of course, you know, depending to the, based on the nation system or millet system. So first, they are looking at that, and then the locality. And then, you know, they were referring to those localities. But the main distinction between different, the different groups for the Ottoman elites, so, you know, they were also creating those hierarchies between their subjects, or, you know, their citizens. So although, you know, the Tanzimat reforms, or the idea, you know, behind the Tanzimat reforms, the modernization reforms, were the equality, or, you know, reaching towards a more equal, and maybe with today's words, like a multi-confessional, multi-regional empire. But in reality, I mean, okay, I mean, it was still multi-confessional, but the reality, I mean, the practice was, it was, I mean, according to the citizenship practices, it was unfortunately never get this aim, like, you know, the equality. So, I mean, the main thing, the identification of the individuals, it was mainly according to the religious affiliation, and then, you know, the local communities. So on the one hand, the state was trying to identify its subjects as citizens, like individual citizens. Still, they were using the local and community networks to identify them. And that's why it was, I mean, until then, I mean, that there was this very, maybe a very short period just after the revolution, 1908, that there were attempts, like, you know, it was not only for the equality, but also, you know, freedom as well. But other than that, until the end of the empire, unfortunately, we don't see this further attempts. So citizenship, like, you know, referring to equality and liberty, were the main issues still, and they stuck into this security threats in a way. Their main references were still the security threats.
Thank you, İlkay, and thank you, Janet. Thank you both for maintaining good time. We are 5 minutes to 1 p.m. I know some of you may have to leave at 1, but I want to make sure that we open the floor to questions from the audience. We had quite a robust audience, as many as 85 or so people here. We still have 60 or so people in the audience. So we will stay on till about 1:30 Eastern time. So another 35 minutes. So please, if you have questions, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you are free to write your question in the comments box if you prefer to do it that way. I will be monitoring that. But again, I would like to open the floor. We have, again, about 35 minutes for questions and answers, and I'm sure that this rich discussion has raised some questions in the minds of the audience. So please, go ahead. Baki, I see that you have raised your hand. Go ahead, please.
İlkay, thank you so much for your presentation. Janet, thanks so much for the commentary. I am still stuck with Margaret, whom you introduced as someone who, on whose passport the government wrote she can have a passport, but on the condition of no return. Do we know more about her life? What kind of threat did she pose that she actually got that no return thing on? And was it a common thing? Like, did Armenians who wanted to visit United States get passports? You always routinely sort of with a stamp saying no return, basically almost losing citizenship rights. Is that a common practice? That's sort of curiosity. I know nothing about this period. And then the other question I have is a bit more general, and I'm not quite sure whether it is meant for you to answer. I mean, other people could pitch in too, maybe. So the sort of parallels between the time that you told us about and today are very much there. And Janet brought those parallels to our attention by reminding your own very predicament, İlkay. So we know what kind of things the Turkish government does, securitization, etc., etc. But at the same time, the government also seeks the votes of the Kurds today. And whether or not, whether we like it or not, the government party is the second largest receiver of votes from Kurds in Turkey. And I believe Erdogan made a point of appointing a ethnically Kurdish vice president, who, of course, never makes a strong identification with that, openly speaking, but everybody knows the vice president is ethnically Kurdish. So at this point in time, in late Ottoman period, if I remember correctly, some Ottoman Armenians who were able to rise up in the bureaucracy were actually, employed at the foreign ministry and especially in international relations kind of things. Do we know anything about how and what they did in this process? Did they have a say-so in the discussions of how to identify people? Did they have any role whatsoever? That must have been a very difficult position. And I'm just curious, is there any literature on sort of Ottoman Armenians who actually were employed in government offices? I believe as late as 1912, 1913, a foreign minister was an Ottoman Armenian. So it's a complicated process. And I wanted to see whether there is any, sort of evidence of some people in the ministry saying, wait a minute, we cannot really call Armenians like this. We need to be more careful. Is there any voices left from, people who were parts of these discussions who were not necessarily Muslim? Or did the ministries only employ Ottoman Armenians in positions where their services of translation would be needed, and they didn't really have part in other things? Since I'm very ignorant about this, I'm just asking. So one question is very specific, the other question is much more general. Go ahead, İlkay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, the story of Margaret and Aznef. So it was not special to them. So basically, after the massacres, there was this new decree about the mobility of Armenians, especially when they aimed to United States. So yeah, I mean, if they want to leave, then they lost their citizenships in a way. But it was only the actually U.S., but also in some certain cases Russia. Because, during and after the massacres, a lot of Armenians, they also ran away from Ottoman Empire to Russia. They ended up in Russia, and the numbers were quite high. And actually, Russian government wanted them to return back to their homelands because, you know, they were quote unquote refugees in a way, right? But they were unwanted. And the Ottoman government actually at that time did not want them back. And, you know, the government tried to implement new regulations, like, you know, and the most important one, actually, it was not a new one, but they wanted to show them that they left the empire with their regular papers, like, you know, orderly papers. Unfortunately, of course, most of them, because of the fact that they were, you know, escaping from violence, they did not have those documents like passports or, you know, internal passports and so on, even, you know, even the identity documents, unfortunately. And then they stuck in this weird diplomatic position. And at some point, I found the documents about this issue. So the commander of the Fourth Army, the Army of Eastern Anatolia or Eastern Provinces, Zeki Pasha, he wrote a report about those people. You know, he wrote the estimated number of those people. And then he said that, you know, we finished the security tests in these provinces, so their return would be a big problem for us in the means of security. So, you know, don't let them to come back. And after long negotiations, and it took nearly 10 years between those two empires, Russia decided to keep them in Russia. But the government wanted them to naturalize, to get the Russian citizenship. And then they had to, give up the Ottoman citizenship. And then they started to run away from Russia to Ottoman Empire. So it created another crisis of quote unquote population. So, it continued. So the main issue was, from my point of view, it was about the population policies, because, at the same time, the great powers were pushing Ottoman Empire to implement the reforms, which were written in the Berlin Treaty. The promise was written in the Berlin Treaty, but then there were these negotiations in 1878 and then 1879, and then just before the massacre wave, actually just after the Sutton massacre. So and then it became an issue. The population numbers were an issue. That's why the regulations about the mobility of Armenians became an important problem for the Ottoman Empire. So they tried to regulate it in this way, like without letting them to. They just forbade them to come back to their lands, and they also lost property during this time. It was not only the citizenship but also the property. Yeah, and the other question, it's a very difficult question. So let me start about the Armenian bureaucrats. So actually, it's really interesting. There are some works on Armenian bureaucrats, but unfortunately there are a few, and they are not looking at this issue. Actually, I thought about it a lot, but I have no answer for this. How they proceed with the Ottoman government. One of the high-level bureaucrats, actually, he was a very famous international law expert, and he was defending the Ottoman government's rights in the court in Belgium after the assassination to Abdülhamit himself. That assassination attempt, actually, it was done by a group of revolutionaries, and one of them was a Belgian. He was holding Belgian citizenship. And this lawyer, unfortunately, I cannot remember the name. He was really active in the case. And then, we see these Armenian bureaucrats, as you said before, holding really important positions. Actually, they were not only the translators, they were really, holding important positions. And in local governors, in the local government level as well. But I have no idea, how they were discussing this issue. I saw some documents that how can I say? I mean, I don't want to generalize these documents, but in some cases they were trying to quote unquote soften the measures with negotiating, with writing to the I don't know, sometimes in the local to the local governor, to the ministry, to different ministries and to the commissions, because it was also the time of the commissions for administration in a way. And for security as well. But yeah, I don't know. And for today's, of course, I mean, there are two very different cases, but from my point of view, I see it like the governing party created its own elites, its own Kurdish elites in a way. So, and the question is if those new Kurdish elites want to solve this political issue, this long-term political issue with democratic ways or not. Because there are always, personal interests involved, unfortunately, in those kind of political appointments and so on. So I don't have an answer in that case.
Of course, I really appreciate it. And today's case is very different in many ways also, because Kurds and the majority ethnicity Turks share Islam as their common point. And I guess AKP really becomes the second largest party in Turkish Kurdistan because of its appeal to Kurds who identify primarily as Muslim. And so that makes, that is not an issue that we could have imagined in the case of the late Ottoman Empire with Armenians. I really appreciate also your response to the first part. It sounds like the Ottomans already had started treating Armenians as modern Israel treats its Palestinian citizens, in the sense of, if they leave, especially the ones that are under occupied territories, they are not citizens really, but if they leave, good, we want them to go, and then they will not be able to come back, basically. That's sort of, it already started in late 1890s then, that attitude.
I recently published an article about the administrative borders in the Eastern Anatolia. I mean, Shakir Pasha, Moshe Shakir Pasha, he was the general inspector of that area for a while to perform the reforms, so-called reforms. And when you look at his files, actually, he was trying to minoritize Armenians in every administrative district. So he was he was planning to, he planned to divide the villages, divide the towns, according to the population numbers. So actually, it was more than the mobility restrictions. They were also, playing like a puzzle, playing with the political geography in that sense, in eastern provinces. So yeah, it started long ago.
Thank you so much. I have another question, but there are questions in the chat, so I'll leave it to David to pick some questions from the chat.
Yeah, so we have right now 3 questions in the chat. I think right now I'll read all 3. And then İlkay, you can respond to those, and please, there's still more time for others to raise questions either in the chat box or through the raise hand function. So Nelly Manassian has a very simple question to answer. Hi, can you share the PDF of this book? I will leave that up to you, İlkay. Luca Nelson Gaben asks, hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I study policing in Syria, Lebanon during the French Mandate, and was wondering if you could maybe detail some of the late Ottoman policies of surveillance in that region. I know of Nadia Özbek's work, but not much else. Thank you very much. And Sumaya Kojaman asks, many thanks for the great book and the panel. Could you elaborate on social engineering of demographics? For instance, the formation of social hubs versus distant places where minorities were positioned or isolated. Also, if you can elaborate on the global context of security and state building practices and how the Ottoman experience is similar or different to other 19th century empires. Many thanks.
Yeah, okay. So Yeah, Syria and Lebanon, French mandate. Yeah, unfortunately, I did not work on that era. I mean, in my book, I only worked the years between 1878 and 1908. So I cannot answer it. But I mean, during this era, of course, you know, for Syria and Lebanon, there were, I mean, today's Lebanon, there were a lot of governmental decrees about the, especially for the ports. Because I mean, this era was also the, I mean, David also wrote about it, the smuggling, right? So this era was also, you know, I mean, one of the most important problems for the Ottoman Empire. I mean, in the means of mobilities, it was not only the mobility of the people, but also the guns and, you know, some certain kind of materials and newspapers because of the censorship. I mean, because of the fact that they could also, you know, they could also create this new kind of political conflicts according to the Ottoman Empire. So, you know, in that sense, yes, I mean, they were quite important, but I didn't work on the mandate period, unfortunately, yeah. And the other question was, I'm trying to see.
It was from Sumaya Kocaman, and
Yeah,
she's asking,
okay.
yeah, she's asking about
Social
the
engineering and
comparison.
demographics. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, they were trying. I mean, the thing is, like, you know, as I said before, like Shakir Pasha's reports and, you know, proposals to the central government. Yeah, they were working on it. But the thing is like, you know, the Ottoman state still did not have enough quote unquote infrastructure, like state infrastructure to practice those reports, or, you know, I mean, those proposals, or, you know, they were putting those bans, for example, I mean, for the mobility, against the mobility of the Armenians, or, you know, Bulgarian revolutionaries and so on. But still, you know, it was an issue to implement it. I mean, in the book, I also wrote about it. Like, you know, on the one hand, we have like so many regulations, decrees, and so on. And of course, I mean, in the files, you can also see that they were like practicing them in a way. But actually, it was still, I mean, when you look at their aim, it was still very limited that what they were doing, or, you know, what they were trying to practice. And another thing is like the formation of social hubs, distant places where minorities positioned, isolated. So yeah, okay, it's another thing. So I cannot say that the Armenians were isolated, but they were mostly silenced. So I mean, the Ottoman state created this quote unquote silent peripheries. But from my point of view, it's difficult to say that they were isolated. Anyways, and global context of security and state building practices, and how Ottoman experience is similar and different in the 19th century empires. So yeah, I mean, the Ottoman Empire, again, from my point of view, when you consider the practices on this issue, the Ottoman Empire had similarities mostly with Russia. But when you look at the European states or European empires, it was a bit different, especially for the internal passports and so on. And for today's security practices, or, I mean, the thing is, I don't know, like, I think what happened after 9/11, in the means of like passport technologies, digital passports, databases, I mean, Interpol's passport database. So it was the turn for the passport technologies. And when you look at these assassination attempts, the assassination of Elizabeth, the Empress Elizabeth, it was also the turn. And we see this, you know, this huge discussions and, you know, new techniques, I mean, practicing new techniques all over Europe and also the Ottoman Empire. So when I have to compare today and the, I mean, late 19th century, most probably I would choose these two moments. Yeah.
Thank you, İlkay. Baki, you have another question. Go ahead. If there are, well, let's see. Are there any other questions first? If not, then Baki, please go ahead.
İlkay, sorry, I'm again just really curious about this. A follow-up to the very last thing you were answering in terms of, comparative empires. You said that they were similar to Russia. I don't know. This is not something you might have done yet, but maybe there is secondary literature about this work, something like yours about Russian Empire. How did Russians Empire treat its Armenian subjects, if there were among them those who wanted to have, let's say, a breakaway republic or things like that? Did they also apply this kind of measuring of securitization, or did they adopt different policies because they had many Armenians, the Russian Armenians? So is there a possible comparison there? And a follow-up question, again, sort of making the comparison more global. How did European empires treat their colonial subjects in terms of passports? Could somebody from Africa just, easily come to Paris, or could somebody from India easily come to London? Did they have restrictions on their colonial subjects that they didn't have on their own internal subjects? I'm curious. This may be something you have studied, something you may never have studied. In this case, don't touch it. And then I'm also very curious about the internal passports you talked about. So if you have time, and there's no other question, but I see that Janet raised her hand, I would like to hear more about internal restrictions on travel. Where were people checked? Is it just Istanbul, or did they divide the empire into zones? And how effective could it be? Like in the middle of nowhere, you have a post. I mean, couldn't people go bypass that? How was that? So I'm trying to get a sense of if you were not, how could you move from one city to another? Did you always have to go through an internal barrier for a move, or was it, every 1,000 miles, or how did they administer that? I'm very curious. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, I'll start with your second question, the colonial subjects. Actually,
Okay, and İlkay, I hate to interrupt. I just want to add that somebody just added a question too that relates to this, and I want to make sure you see it. Also asking about Russian Jews, and it's similar to what Baki was asking about colonial subjects. So I thought maybe you could address Ayşe Humeira's question there about Russian Jews, since I think it also somewhat connects to this question.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm starting with the colonial subjects. Actually, yeah. One of my colleagues now working on this issue actually in Germany. So they're looking at Haiti. The revolution of Haiti, and how the concepts of quote unquote the exiles, colonial subjects, and passports, how they relate with each other. So interestingly, yeah, it was also an issue and also, slavery as well. So it was also an issue for the colonial empires, especially, for the traffic in and out the Atlantic. And it was also interesting, like I was also working with the German files here. I haven't used them yet. And how the discussions about the European exiles in Ottoman Empire ended up to discuss. They were discussing about this issue, but then they ended up to discuss about the colonial subjects of the Great Britain and also the France. So these concepts were like very related to each other. Because the empires themselves, they wanted to, differentiate, quote unquote, their subjects, again, according to different hierarchies, different status, like who would be the citizen, who would be the colonial subject, or, so yeah, so there's an ERC project going on this issue, this specific question that you asked. Now I think they just finished their first year. So another thing, the third question, the internal passport checks. Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, the thing is, the regulation was, so actually this, you know, this whole idea, Mürür Tezkeresi, actually, it was a practice, or I can say that it started with the Celali rebellions. And you know, of course, you know, in this long period, it was bureaucratized in a way. And in the late Ottoman Empire, I mean, during the Hamidian era, we had both the regulation, I mean, the code, the law, and also the decrees about internal passports. So you know, first you have to have your internal passport. So your internal passport has to be issued by a local authority, but for that you need proof of identity or proof of good behavior, and then you know you start your journey. At some point you want to go to in an hostel inn anyway, so you have to show your travel documents to stay there. Or I don't know, you are going to somewhere to work. You know, you want to work in a construction site, for example, in Smyrna. Then you have to show your internal passport. Then they can get you in. I mean, they can get you the permission to work. But first, I mean, the original thing is, I mean, when you go to somewhere, when you aim to go somewhere, then first you have to go to this local bureau, and then the local office, and then it has to be issued again, and you have to be registered as a traveler. So I mean, in Istanbul, it was quite important, but in other places, yes, there were these, of course, lack of infrastructure and so on. And another thing is like, you have to, in some cases, you also have to show those documents if there was an epidemic going on. So there can be like irregular checks on the way as well, so it was a bit different. And the question of Russia, yeah, I mean, for the Russia at that time, the biggest threat was the nihilist movement. So, it was the anarchists and nihilists, and this, this assassination wave, actually, it started in Russia, right? And it started with the nihilist movement. So, on the one hand, yes, I mean, in Russia, there were also like, labeled minority groups like Jews. But on the other hand, the main issue for the Russian government was to eliminate nihilism and the nihilist movement and the people who were involved in this movement and anarchism. So, and, when you compare those empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, so, I mean, their use of internal passports were quite similar. They were not the same, they were different, but when you compare them to other empires, these two, they had similarities. And also use of passport, it was also quite similar. And when you look at those international conferences, the Conference of Rome and also this St. Petersburg, and afterwards the St. Petersburg Protocol, actually Ottoman Empire and Russia politically, they were trying to define anarchism or anarchist act in a similar way, or they were trying to push like harder regulations in the means of controlling mobility or extradition treaties, for example. In that sense, these two empires, they were like in collaboration in the means of creating a new inter-imperial or trans-imperial system of police surveillance. Of course, they were in competition, right? Yeah, I mean, all those empires, they were also in competition, but they were also like sharing information and so on. And even, sharing information about anarchists, for example, it continued even during the First World War. Even they were fighting with each other. So I find it quite remarkable, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Janet, go ahead. Why don't you, since we're about 5 minutes away, why don't you have the last question, and İlkay can have the last word?
I'm fine. I'll give İlkay the last word.
Oh, you don't want to? I think we have time to post a question if you'd like.
There is also a question in the chat from Professor Toledano from I think. Oh no, Ayşe Hümeyra. Why did I say Toledano? I'm very sorry. Ayşe Hümeyra.
Yeah, she addressed İlkay addressed Ayşe's question about the comparison with Russia.
All right. Okay.
Janet,
So-
go ahead.
I was just noticing that in the book, you know, when you were talking about Shakir Pasha's report, İlkay, and how Shakir Pasha was kind of wanting to manipulate, engineer the Armenian population in different districts to dilute, you know, the population, something that Taner Akçam and Ümit Üngür have written about, you know, the 5 to 10% population managing. And you also talk about Saadettin Pasha in your book, and his, I was wondering if you had read his memoir or his diary. It's more like a diary rather than a memoir, in which he's also kind of dealing with some of these in the, you know, he's tasked with going to the eastern provinces and kind of convincing Kurds to be on board with the reform projects. And he is also into convincing Kurds, you know, about their nativity. And you mentioned that using a different source. And I was just wondering how you wanted to bring that into the conversation.
You mean Saadettin Pasha's diary, or
Yeah.
his approach to the
Both
Kurds?
together.
Okay, I mean, actually, now this question is
And
about my current project. So now,
oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So you could leave us with that.
So yeah, I mean, now I'm working on this long-term securitization of the eastern provinces, and I'm researching the era between the Berlin Treaty until 1952. So, you know, I'm really looking at this long-term securitization. So I'm trying to understand how those reports, you know, I mean, Shakir Pasha's report, or, you know, Saadettin Pasha's mission, or the, you know, reports of Zeki Pasha, the Fourth Army, how, you know, they wrote those reports, or, you know, those proposals, like in around like 1890s, from 1880s to, you know, late 1890s, let's say. But interestingly, I mean, those reports came up, like, you know, the main ideas of those reports, or, you know, the main technicalities, or the main conflicting realities, I can say, that they noted down. We also see them during the early republic. I mean, you know, this Şark Islahat Raporu, and then, you know, there were also like different voices, like Celal Bayar's report about the issue and so on. So, you know, how they were discussing about the political geography with its peoples, in a way, how they, you know, how they were, quote unquote, trying to construct the infrastructures of security on the one hand, but at the same time, you know, when you look at those reports, most of them, they were written in a very technical language. But this own language, I mean, this language also creates a certain kind of mentality, which had like this long-term effects. You know, although they had their own discussions, like, for example, I don't know, like Sheikh Shakir and Zeki Pasha's, both of them, you know, they were trying to, you know, they were working together in a way, but they had like different ideas about some certain reform packages. And they had even, like, you know, very hard discussions. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to use those, both the documents and diaries, or, you know, some personal accounts, to understand, you know, how this process, I mean, as a process, securitization, how it functioned and how it created long-term violence in the region. So yeah, and Saadettin Pasha, of course, I mean, he was one of them. And, you know, all these commission members, because, you know, after every massacre, they created those investigation commissions. I mean, it started in Damascus, actually, in 1860s. And back then, you know, it was the head of the commission, as far as I remember, it was the Fuad Pasha. But, you know, then, you know, in every violent clash, we see those commissions. So they also became part of the state formation in a way. And, you know, all these were like different layers of this process, you know, the bureaucrats, their proposals, reports, how they relate with these peoples on the ground. And, you know, and of course, you know, not only in Eastern provinces, but, you know, how this information or knowledge exchange happened between different regions of the empire, and, you know, also temporally, like you know, in the temporal way as well. So it was not only about this trans-regional way, but also, you know, yeah, so, yeah.
Thank you so much, İlkay. I think we are at time. So I think now is time to bid adieu to our guests who are still here. This was a great dialogue, a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, İlkay, for taking the time, and to Janet and to Baki for organizing this. This was great to be able to stick around for this. Luca also says thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.